Today's reading is from Genesis chapter 15, and it's the Lord's covenant with Abram, as he's called in this chapter. The Lord's covenant with Abram. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant of my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up to the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord, who brought you out of the Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I shall gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, that they will be enslaved and ill-treated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking brazier with a flaming torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, To your descendants I give this land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Raphites, Ammonites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites.
So we're back to Abraham. I want to begin by asking, I wonder whether you have made any promises this week, this month, or in your lifetime. Big ones, small ones, ones you meant most sincerely, and possibly ones you just made to wriggle out of a difficult situation. Some of us are wearing jewellery that symbolises promises that we've made to our husband or wife. Perhaps you're aware of promises you've made and subsequently broken, whether intentionally or not. In the early service, we were having a little chat around our tables about promises that we might have made and broken, and I won't disclose any names, but one of them did involve a promise to make a particular dessert for a loved one that they then couldn't really be bothered making, so it never quite happened. And sometimes there are bigger ones, aren't there? Sometimes there are promises that people make and don't fulfill, and we can feel hurt about those. And even children make pinky promises with their fingers, don't they? If you want some truly fascinating reading, Google the history of the pinky promise. We went down a real rabbit hole at our staff meeting the other day, talking about pinky promises, and we looked it all up. It's quite bizarre and quite gory, actually. So that's something very bizarre. But promises seem to be part and parcel of human life, of human relationships, and they've already been a central theme in our journey with Abraham. But the chapter we're looking today is absolutely pivotal, not just for our understanding of the Old Testament, but also for the New Testament. It marks a definitive turning point in salvation history. God is about to take promises to the next level. So last week, quick recap, especially for the confused of brain like me. Last week we saw Abraham and his nephew Lot moving further into the promised land, together with all their possessions and their livestock. They needed to spread out to ensure enough pasture for all the animals. And we saw Abraham growing in his ability to make godly decisions, consulting with the Lord, not held back by fear or control issues, but arriving calmly and peacefully at decisions about the way forward. And Lot heads off for the bright lights, while Abraham finds a spot near the great trees at Mamre where he builds an altar to the Lord. And God promises Abraham land and offspring. Now we're missing out chapter 14 because it doesn't really move the narrative forward that much. Basically, there are some skirmishes between a bunch of kings. Lot gets captured. Abraham rescues him, recovers his stuff, and the wonderfully named Melchizedek, who is both a priest and a king, shows up and blesses Abraham. The king of Sodom offers Abraham the spoils of war, but Abraham isn't interested in wealth. He is focused on God's plan, and God's plan really is what we're focusing on. So we've just skipped a bit of that random skirmishing. So this chapter begins on a high. Abraham receives a vision from God, and twice it says that the word of the Lord came to him. And that in the Old Testament is like a code. It marks him out as a prophet. Here, prophet, God, the word of the Lord. God begins by saying what he so often says, don't be afraid. All through the Bible, don't be afraid. What are we always doing? Getting afraid, worrying, being scared. Don't be afraid. And then he declares that he's Abraham's shield, his protector, and his very great reward. And that seems to me like a triple blessing. It's like the past, the present, and the future. He can leave the fear behind. God's with him right now, and even greater blessings to come. So Abraham hears and acknowledges what God is saying. He calls him Sovereign Lord. He recognizes God's authority and protection over his life. But he's still mulling over the big promises that God has made to him previously. He's got stuck on the question of children. And to me, it's a bit like those memes. There was a fashion a while ago online for these pictures where you see how it started and how it's going. So how it started for Abraham, great expectations. How's it going? Not so great. He's old, he's childless, his wife is seemingly barren. And the prospects look bleak from the family point of view. He has wealth, but he's got no heir to pass it on to. And according to a particular law that was operating at that time, the Hurrian law, childless couples could adopt an heir who would become their servant. And Abraham seems to have taken on this guy, Eliezer of Damascus, which is fine. Presumably he's doing his serving well, he's rounding up the livestock or unpacking the bags or whatever. But he's dismayed to think that Eliezer is going to be the one to inherit his wealth, to be his heir. It doesn't sit well with Abraham, and it doesn't match up to his understanding of God's promise. And he seems to be going through the process that I think many of us go through when we struggle with the reality of circumstances, or when the waiting period seems to feel uncomfortably prolonged. He starts to downgrade God's promise. He believes it means something, but he starts to reason himself into just lowering his expectations. And God responds by offering a double reassurance. First, he gives him specific information, the fine print of the promise, if you like. No, the servant's not going to become the heir. That's not what God meant by the promise of offspring. He spells it out for Abraham. A son coming from your own body will be your heir. Very clear, specific words and details. And then he takes Abraham outside And he provides a visual illustration. Abraham's offspring will be like the stars, God says, numerous to the point of being uncountable. And I love what the writer Walter Brueggemann said about this. It is the caring majesty of God that makes the connection. The same God who makes stars beyond number can make a son for this barren family. God's promise is generous, it's far-reaching, and it's secure. And notice that God doesn't become angry with Abraham. He isn't surprised by Abraham's questions or doubts. Abraham does have faith. He also has wobbles. I have faith, and sometimes I have wobbles. How about you? I find it massively encouraging that God creates this space for Abraham to voice his concerns, his misgivings, and he takes time to offer him reassurance. God is sovereign. He's the promise maker, promise keeper. He's the one who's brought Abraham to the promised land, but he's also the compassionate one who knows us better than we know ourselves. He sees our frailty, our internal battles, and he shields and strengthens us right in the midst. Now, verse 6 is a really key verse in this passage. Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. You need your teeth in to read that verse. God shows compassion and offers reassurance, and Abraham accepts these gladly. He believes and trusts the Lord. He takes God at his word that what he has said he will do, he will in fact do. And God takes account of that. He recognizes Abraham as a righteous man, a man devoted to God and aligned with God's will and his ways. But then only 2 verses later, after that high point, Abraham's questioning God again. This time it's about the land. So this is not about an unshakable, wobble-proof faith, walking in absolute confidence and victory. That is not what I see in Abraham in this passage. And I was thinking about this. I think it's more that Abraham has arrived at a point where he can separate his uncertainty from God's good intentions, his own limitations, from God's unlimited supply. He believes that God will do what he's promised, that God has the power and freedom and commitment to bring the promises to pass. He has proven God's faithfulness to him over time, but he's still mystified about the mechanics, the details. He still wants to see how things will unfold. And that uncertainty, that earthbound, limited perspective is sometimes exposed. Abraham believed God could and would fulfill his promises, and God saw that belief and counted it as righteousness, even though Abraham still had questions. And perhaps I'm labouring the point here, but for me, this is really crucial encouragement of this passage, that God uses and blesses and affirms the wobbliest of saints. There's hope for us all. And I think it's the difference between saying, God, I'm not sure you can really do that, and saying, God, I have no idea how you're going to do that, but I can't wait to find out. And Paul points back to this moment in his teaching on faith in Romans 4. And if you have time later this week, you can read over that chapter. It's got wonderful reflections on this passage. And Paul makes the link between Abraham's faith and ours crystal clear. Abraham did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. This is why it was credited to him as righteousness. The words, I love how Paul, he spells it right out. He's like, no stone unturned with Paul. The words, it was credited to him, were written not for him alone, but also for us, to whom God will credit righteousness, for us who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. So it's the same promise-making, promise-keeping, life-giving, miracle-working God, same simple faith response that God, by his tremendous grace, counts as holy and righteous. So God and Abraham have been in conversation for some time, and now God moves to action. He cuts a covenant with him. A covenant was a solemn treaty commonly used in that part of the world. It was the most binding form of agreement between people, and it involved this elaborate ritual. These various animals were brought for sacrifice. They're killed and divided, and part would be burned as an offering and part would be consumed in a community feast. And the people making the covenant passed between the different parts to represent their commitment. And the point is that anyone who would break the covenant is understood to be under the threat of, this is what's going to happen to you, pal, if you break this covenant. If I break this covenant, may it be like I've been, torn in two by wild animals or whatever. It's pretty gory. It was gory times, I don't recommend doing this at home. So they're basically saying, on pain of death, I will keep these solemn promises between us. And if you want to find another example of that in the Bible, there's another one in Jeremiah 34. You see an example with some kings that do this kind of ritual. So God asks Abraham, bring the animals and the birds, and fire appears and passes between the halves of the carcasses. And fire in the Old Testament is a sign of God's presence and holiness. And what do you know? We found Pentecost again by accident. Because fire is the sign of God's presence at Pentecost, isn't it? Tongues of fire that seem to rest on the people. So fire comes. But Abraham doesn't walk up and down between the animal pieces. He's actually immobilized. He's kind of in a sleep of darkness. So the covenant, the point is, the covenant comes from God's side. It's his unilateral commitment to Abraham and his descendants. God walks alone through the stuff and says, I am making this commitment to you. It's a gift from God. Now, it's not the first time that God's made a covenant. He made a covenant before with Noah, a commitment that he would never again destroy the earth with a flood. But this one goes further. God promises to give this huge piece of land to Abraham's descendants. Now, it's not all good news. He also says they're going to endure 400 years of exile and oppression and slavery, but they're going to come through it as a people. They're going to enter into the inheritance that God has prepared for them. And Abraham's doubts are not entirely unfounded. It is going to be a rocky road, but God says he can know for certain that God is with them and God is ultimately in control of events. And this theme of covenant continues to grow and develop through the Old and New Testaments. God will make a further covenant with Moses on Mount Sinai, giving God's people the law to live by, calling for them to respond in obedience. And then in Jesus, God makes a new and better covenant. He does away with sacrifices forever because Jesus becomes the one perfect sacrifice for all sin. And we live under grace. We choose to respond to God in freedom, to his faithfulness and love. And later in the service, we're going to share communion, which is the sign, the remembering sign of that new covenant. So faith didn't come easily to Abraham. He wrestled, he reasoned, he disputed, but finally he arrives at this place of deep trust and conviction. He chooses to look beyond the immediate circumstances and embrace a wonderful hope based on who God was and how faithful he had been to Abraham in times past. And as you reflect on your own journey of faith, I wonder how it strikes you. If you were to draw it on a piece of paper, would it be a kind of straight line from A to B? Or would it be a lot squigglier than that? I think it probably would. Chances are there will have been some ups and downs. Times when you believed strongly in God and were confident of his presence in your life. Times when things maybe felt just a bit flat, a bit stodgy. Maybe times of real crisis, wondering where God was or whether you even wanted to keep following him. Now, I love the verse in Hebrews that says, faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. I say I love it. I love how it sounds when someone says it, because it sounds really confident and positive. But I also find it really problematic. Because what if I don't feel sure that day? Or what if I don't feel certain? Does that mean I don't have faith? Does that mean I'm a second-rate Christian? If a lot of people around you seem to have that strong, confident faith, we can sometimes feel tempted to fake it. just to fit in, sing the songs, pray the prayers, silence that voice inside that asks uncomfortable questions. Maybe having faith is just about being gullible or naive. A friend said to me once, did you hear they've taken the word gullible out of the English dictionary? Fell for it. Very gullible. So is faith just gullible? Is it just pretending everything in the garden is rosy all the time? If we say enough pious words or put on a brave face, is that what God's going to be pleased with? But I love that Abraham didn't fake it. He wore his heart on his sleeve. He voiced his fears, his doubts, his questions, his disappointments. And God was always encouraging him to go deeper, keep following, keep trusting, not condemning him for the ups and downs. It is normal to experience different seasons in our spiritual life. And some of that's to do with our age and general development. God doesn't change, but our personal understanding of ourselves, of the world, of God can fluctuate. Children develop an understanding of the world. They make sense of things a certain way, and that framework might serve them well for a time. But then they turn to adolescence and that framework can kind of explode because there's new information, new experiences, there's a whole lot of stuff going on. And a child that's brought up in a particular belief system might reject it, might question it, might continue with it, but just come to a different shape of their understanding of it. You're always making these little adjustments. Adults develop, they have further experiences, explorations, questions. Our faith becomes kind of more nuanced. As we encounter different perspectives, we meet each other, we hear things from different people's viewpoints, and we live out our beliefs in the middle of a complex world. And midlife, this is a theme of mine these days, midlife is another time, a bit like adolescence, when things can explode again. It has a shaking and a testing when old certainties maybe get questioned. Shaking and testing, but that's okay. It's okay for that to happen because we can hold on to God throughout, sometimes comfortably and easily, sometimes with a lot more wrestling and wriggling. Our faith is gradually deepened and refined. It is a living thing, an organic thing. And there's a commentary on Genesis that made this observation. Those who know the way of faith will nevertheless find God leading into ever new circumstances in which to trust him. New ventures create new tensions for us because they call us into the unknown. So it's very unlikely we'll get to stay in a safe place where our belief system is always exactly the same for our whole life, because life's just not like that. We change, we get pushed on, and that's how we grow. God often will move us through different seasons and experiences. So how do we move from uncertainty to deeper faith? How do we avoid the testing points or crisis points dragging us down or leading us away from God? I think it's important to be honest with God and with one another and within our families and within our church family. We need to hold a kind of space for doubting, for wobbles, for questions. We can't eliminate or eradicate those. It's not possible and it's not really healthy. We can pray for each other, encourage one another, listen to one another, and we can find our own voices while acknowledging other people's perspectives. Not everyone has exactly the same life experiences. Not everyone has exactly the same questions. My questions are very different from my husband's questions because we're just wired differently. We see the world differently. And what we can do is share what helps us in our struggles, and we can be a supportive presence when we see that other people are struggling. We can let them know that it's okay, that we're okay with them, that God's okay with them, that we're praying, that we're there. And ultimately, we can recognise there are questions we will never resolve. There are some things that will always remain mysteries, but we can still continue to believe in the goodness of God and follow in his ways. Our commitment to God, I find, can be as changeable as the weather. Often we just need to recall God's past faithfulness and pray for patience as we wait to see how God will move and act. It takes time to develop trust. It takes time for faith to grow to maturity. We can recognize that God's commitment to us is unchanging. He will keep his promises. He will uphold the covenant that he's made with humanity. And I want to sort of round this sermon off by playing a song that expresses the heart of what we've been exploring today. A beautiful, uplifting song. I'm just going to read you the first verse, because it's bang on message for today. God of Abraham, God of covenants and of faithful promises, time and time again, you have proven you'll do just what you said. Though the storms may come and the winds may blow, I'll remain steadfast. And let my heart learn when you speak a word, it will come to pass. Great is your faithfulness to me. So we'll listen to this song and meditate on God's commitment to us. And then we'll move into another song and then into communion.
Your faithfulness to me. Great is your faithfulness to me. From the rising sun to the setting same, I will praise your name. Great is your faithfulness to me. God from age to age, though the earth may pass away, your word remains the same. Can prove there's nothing you can't do. You're faithful and true. Though the storms may come and the winds may blow, I'll remain steadfast and let my heart learn when you speak a word, it will come to pass. Oh, great is your faithfulness to me. Your faithfulness to me. From the rising sun to the setting same, I will praise your name. Great is your faithfulness to me. So great, so great, your faithfulness through every season. I've seen it, I will see it. Yeah. I'll put my faith in Jesus, my anchor to the ground, my